Previously, we had discussed how the previous grid that was in Boxcutter, the infinite grid, was undergoing some changes, and that in a future update we would be seeing the grid with an entirely new face. And this is what the grid looked like in the previous versions. One of the things I want you to observe is how there's a slight haze in between the cells of the grid, which was something that always kind of drove me crazy, and I wasn't sure why it was there. But there's no preference in order that's capable of actually removing that haze, and it's just a systematic issue of the way the grid was. But it was always a constant reminder to me that things could always be better with the grid. So now we jump over to the current version of Boxcutter 718.7. And enabling grid is pretty much just as easy as just clicking the grid icon in the top bar. In fact, even if you have the magnet off, you can just click on the grid icon and voila, you're in grid. And we see that there's a label that now lets us know that we're in grid. And this means that basically if we hold control, we now have a grid on the surface. We can roll the wheel just like before. In order to adjust the scale, the grid will be raycasted to the surface as we hold control. The option of adaptive is still present, where you can turn on adaptive and you'll see that the grid updates as you roll over the surface. I don't actually have much of a use of this in my own personal workflow, but it does exist as a kind of technical debugger of sorts for us to be able to quickly read what's going on with the grid. Also, when it comes to the grid, let's go ahead and put an edge here, and we'll select these 2 points and also put an edge here with J. If we press Shift V and change our orientation system to the nearest edge, we can also see that in adaptive we're able to kind of do a scanning mode where we're able to see the grid update in real time as it's locating alternative orientation modes that are generated by the geometry that's actually underlying. So a lot of the things that existed with the previous version of grid is still there. However, a couple of things also have changed. For example, there's now a lock icon, which currently is connected to Increment Lock, but someday in the future it'll become something that I hope to call just Snap Lock, where basically you'll be able to tap control and leave the grid and it will be oriented. But of course you can hold control and continue the entire active scanning lifestyle even though adaptive is no longer on. So here we see that we've got a coordinate that we want. We can actually begin working off the surface, begin drawing the shape, and even if we don't highlight the dot exactly whenever we draw, it should actually jump to the nearest dot. And while we're in this state, we can still hold control, roll the wheel, and just in this mode with the lock enabled, you no longer have to hold control. So it's just a little bit more of a relaxing way to use grid if you're trying to have a more chill experience whenever it comes to using it. Of course, I'm orienting myself near an edge and pressing control again to adjust the rotation as I roll the wheel, but also keeping this as my orientation mode, because if I were to do it over here, we see that the orientation mode is getting changed. While I'm still looking at it from this flat view, I can press Alt X, press V, and even mirror this from V if I want to begin working with this as my particular viewpoint. So here I'm just holding control, locating the axis that I want to begin working on as far as orientation, working my way off of the surface, drawing a box, extruding down, pressing B to bevel. And really that's how easy it is to get acquainted with the new grid. So basically it's a facelift, but this grid is definitely capable of much more than the previous version. We put a lot of work into making grid capable of handling more cells. For example, right now we're looking at this displaying about 16 cells. In the previous update, we made our grid capable of handling 100 cells at a reasonable speed. That was always the issue with infinite grid, was that speed concerns caused us to have to make the grid actually limit the amount of cells in order to keep a fast experience. But we see that even with 100 cells that things are still going fast. And the crazy thing about this grid is that even if we jump up to say 500, which is an astronomical number that's just too much, we see that everything is still working fast, and we're able to even scroll back and move our grid around and see it move in action, and it's performing quick, and there's no longer a speed hang that comes up with it. So it's definitely the fastest version of our grid yet. And so with that, I can press D, jump into Ngon. Notice how the grid remains up on screen even though I brought up the D pi, and we're just drawing a shape based off of our grid. Sometimes I find grid to be a little bit dominating in terms of workflow, so I'm more privy to sometimes just use dots as a temporary jump off and rely on the systems inherent to the snapping, such as suggestive snap with the sole dot that you see pop up, and also angle lock, which allows us to snap at a particular angle no matter what line we draw. But with that, you're basically seeing the new grid in action. There's a little bit more to it than just that. So let's turn off the lock so that way grid will go away whenever we release control. And you also see that every time I press control, the grid just shows up instantaneously, even at 500 points, which is something that has been on the wish list for a very long time when it comes to grid. I'll bring it back down to something more reasonable like 10, because you really don't need that many points when it comes to using a grid that's able to go on to infinity painted under your cursor. So another thing about grid is that there's a special fade parameter for it. So we see that currently my fade time is 0, which means that I press control, that grid pops up immediately. However, we can have some fun with this and set our fade to something like 150. There's no sound effect Easter eggs connected to grid at this time, in case you're wondering, but you know, who knows what the future holds. So we see that by setting it to 150, we have a much more graceful grid entry. In fact, let's set it to something like 300 because I'm a fan of the dramatic. And we see that now the grid comes in just ever so gently like a summer breeze. And if we set the exit time to something crazy like 3800, we are able to basically paint grids on the surface and they'll fade out with individual fade times, just a testament to the amount of stability that's now present in this new grid system. We've worked in the past at having fade work with shapes. We've worked on having fade work with multiple shapes at the same time in our own individual timers. And now we see the culmination of all that work in this new dynamic grid that now is able to have individual fade timers on different instances of the grid. Right now, it's more of a novelty, which doesn't make any sense. However, someday in the future, we hope to be able to paint grids and have grids converge on screen and allow users to create grids based off of the underlying geometry, allowing for a more interesting snapping experience. But for now, you can just set it to something high and just watch grids fade out ever so slow. And the same thing can be said for dots. For example, let's set this to something like 4800. And we see that the dot will actually take longer to fade out than the grid, which is just an interesting way of working for me. Not saying that this is anything useful for workflow, but sometimes you just want to just have a really trippy experience whenever you're working with orientation, and on those late nights, this can definitely be a little bit more interesting. But continuing on, the final thing I want to talk about is the return of the view dot, which I talked about previously, where now there's a view dot, and if you have nothing selected, there's also a world dot. We can see that at the top it says world in the orientation area, and being red means that it's being overridden. And this is just a reminder. So this system is actually powered by the dynamic grid. So if we go under grid, we see that we have settings for the amount of spacing. So let's just set this to something like 1. And if we turn this off and we're back in dots, we see that dot is adhering to the settings that were specified by the dynamic system. Previously in the past, we had multiple dots on screen that would fade out in the distance, but that system was lost. And so in our process of getting it restored, we at least have a singular dot to just help users be more aware whenever they're working. In this case, of course, I'm not able to snap from dot to dot, and that is because I need to actually go in and increment and enable Increment Lock, which will enable me to snap 2 increments, which I find to be a really strict way of working. But if you're trying to draw precisely within the bounds of a particular increment, just know that Increment Lock is there for you, and it supports dots as well. But dots also is enhanced by grid, if that makes any sense. So a weird thing about the last version of Boxcutter, if you were to deselect a shape and say draw grid, right, and right click cancel, when you press control again, you'll have this phantom grid. And to show this in action again, I'm just going to click to begin a cut, right click to cancel, and let's try it again. Right click cancel, and it looks like I can only do it once, making a fool out of me, but you get the idea. Having a double grid on screen is just a bit of an annoyance for everyone. I mean, you're still able to work with the grid present, but every time you bring up the grid, there would always be this phantom grid. And for that reason, we also need to just replace the old system because it was showing its age. So this is something that has been resolved in the latest version. Just to show the level of solve that's been done to this, we're going to set our shape fade to something like 9,000. And we're also going to set our grid and dots up for exit fade of 9,000, just to be sarcastic. And so we're just going to draw a shape, press H to make it solid. And we're just going to snap a bunch of grids, make this fade, click on File, New, General, and we see that nothing remains in the new file. And this was something that was a bit of a problem in the last version. In fact, let's test out that same issue. Let's expand Display, set our fade to something like 9,000, that was 900. And let's just click on this, bring the shape down, click on File, New, General, don't save, and we see that we now permanently have this shape forever. And not saying that, you know, people definitely shouldn't be saving their file while a shape is fading, but definitely is something that we should have been able to take care of. So I'm happy to announce that this has also been resolved as well. When I was talking about issues with the grid and fade and stuff like that, you know, there was even a release where we had to take fade out because it was causing some instabilities. So we had to really look back and actually examine what we were going for and how we were going to execute in order to ensure that the path we were taking was the most efficient. I mean, I definitely am not the type of person who would want to get rid of any of our systems, but fade is something that we view as kind of an aesthetic on the experience, but we definitely have done all we can to ensure that it works as fluid as possible for this particular release.